You think you know what slavery looked like in the ancient world? You have seen the images, the chains, the quarries, the galley ships. You have been given a picture of slavery as brutal labor, broken bodies hauling stone under the Mediterranean sun. And that picture is real. But it is incomplete. Because there was another kind of slavery in the Roman world, one that the history books mention in passing, one that modern audiences instinctively look away from, and one that Jesus walked directly into the middle of every single day. What happened to a young man captured in war, purchased in a market, and kept not for his hands, but for his body? What did his mornings look like? What did his silence cost him? What did it mean to be beautiful in a world that treated beauty as property? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels, and how we understand the compassion of a rabbi who stopped, looked, and saw the people everyone else had been trained not to see. The Roman Empire of the 1st century was the largest slave economy the ancient world had ever produced. Historians estimate that in the city of Rome alone, somewhere between 30% and 40% of the population was enslaved. Across the broader empire, from the shores of Britannia to the deserts of Syria, the number of enslaved people may have reached 10 to 12 million. This was not a footnote to Roman civilization. It was the engine. Every plate of food on a senator's table, every amphora of wine carried through a corridor, every lamp trimmed and burning at midnight. All of it moved through enslaved hands. But the Roman economy of slavery was not monolithic. It was stratified, specialized, and deeply hierarchical, even within its own brutality. There were slaves who worked the fields of the latifundia, the great agricultural estates of Italy and North Africa, who lived in barracks called ergastula, chained at night, worked past exhaustion, replaced when they broke like worn tools. There were slaves in the mines of Spain and Sardinia who rarely saw sunlight and died within years of their capture. And then there were slaves who occupied a very different position. Not because their lives were less controlled, but because what was demanded of them was different in kind. If you were a young man in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century, in Judea, in Syria, in Asia Minor, in Greece, and you were captured in a military campaign, or sold by a father who could not feed his family, or simply taken from a road at the wrong moment, your fate depended on one thing above almost everything else: what a Roman buyer decided you were worth, and for what purpose. If you were strong, you went to labor. If you were educated, you might become a secretary or a tutor. And if you were young and considered physically attractive by Roman aesthetic standards, a category that Rome defined with precision and without shame, you entered a market that had its own vocabulary, its own prices, its own infrastructure, and its own particular form of annihilation. The Romans called these slaves by several names: deliciae, concubini, pueri delicati, boys of pleasure, though the term extended well into what we would consider adulthood. They were sold at specialized auctions, sometimes displayed on rotating platforms. Their bodies examined the way a buyer might examine a horse. Their teeth, their skin, the symmetry of their features, the smoothness of their limbs, all of it evaluated, priced, and recorded. A particularly desirable young man could sell for sums that would purchase an entire house in a provincial city. The Emperor Nero, according to the historian Suetonius, is said to have paid the equivalent of a small fortune for a single enslaved boy whose appearance pleased him. If you are finding this content valuable, this kind of deep historical reconstruction that brings the world of Jesus into focus, consider subscribing to this channel. There is much more of this world left to uncover, and every story matters. The household in which such a slave lived was not, on the surface, a place of visible chains. It was often a wealthy Roman domus, a house built around an open courtyard, the atrium, where light fell in a vertical column from the opening in the roof and struck the marble floor below. The walls might be painted in deep reds and ochres, decorated with scenes of mythology. The smell of the place was a particular mixture: stone dust, lamp oil, cooking smoke drifting from the culina at the back of the house, and the heavy sweetness of the perfumes that wealthy Romans applied with precision and abundance. In the morning, the house came alive with the sounds of a dozen enslaved workers moving through their assigned tasks. Water carried from the cistern, bread from the market wrapped in cloth, the sound of a stylus scratching on wax, the murmur of the master receiving early visitors in the tablinum, the room that opened directly onto the atrium and served as the formal space of business and reception. And somewhere in that house, in a room that had no public function, lived the young man whose presence was not mentioned to visitors, whose name appeared in no official record, and whose silence was not incidental. It was required. His day did not begin with his own will. It began when he was called. The Roman legal framework surrounding slavery was, in its own way, extraordinarily coherent. It had to be. A system that controlled millions of people across dozens of provinces could not function on chaos alone. It required law, precedent, and the kind of philosophical justification that educated men could recite at dinner parties without discomfort. And Roman law provided exactly that. Under Roman jurisprudence, an enslaved person was classified not as a human being in any legally meaningful sense, but as a res, a thing, property. The same category that contained a table, a field, an amphora of grain. This was not a careless metaphor or a rhetorical flourish. It was the operative legal reality that governed every transaction, every punishment, every relationship between a slave and the world around him. The master's authority over his slave, the Dominica Potestas, was, in principle, absolute. He could direct the slave's labor, determine his sleeping arrangements, administer punishment at will, and exercise sexual access without any legal consequence whatsoever. Roman law did not recognize the rape of an enslaved person as a crime. It recognized it as a property owner's use of his own property. This was the world that produced the boy in the wealthy Roman household. And what made his situation distinct, what separated him from the field slave or the mine slave in ways that require careful attention, was precisely the language that surrounded him. Because Rome did not describe what happened to him in the language of violence. Rome described it in the language of affection. The term delicia itself meant delight. Pueri delicati were spoken of in Roman poetry with a tenderness that can feel, to a modern reader, almost indistinguishable from love. The poet Martial wrote of such boys with elaborate sentimentality. Statius mourned the death of a master's delicia with the formal vocabulary of grief. The philosopher Seneca, who was by no means the worst of Roman men, mentioned the presence of such slaves in wealthy households almost as a matter of course, the way one might mention the furniture. This linguistic softening was not accidental. It was load-bearing. It allowed Roman society to participate in a system of institutionalized sexual exploitation while maintaining the self-image of a civilization defined by order, beauty, and cultured refinement. The violence was real. The vocabulary concealed it. And the boy at the center of all this learned, very quickly, that the concealment was part of what was required of him. He was not only expected to be available, he was expected to appear willing, to smile at the right moment, to perform an ease and a pleasure he did not possess. Imagine what that costs a person. Not over a year, over a day, over an hour. The architecture of the Roman domus itself participated in this concealment. The house was designed around the principle of controlled visibility. Who could see what, from where, and under what circumstances? The atrium was public, the place of reputation and display. The cubicula, the small private rooms arranged around the perimeter of the house, were not. They had no windows facing the street. Their doors opened inward. Sound inside them did not carry far. The transition from the public atrium to the private cubiculum was, architecturally, a transition from the world of witnesses to the world of no witnesses. The young enslaved man navigated this geography every day. He knew which rooms were safe in the sense that they contained other people. He knew which corridors led toward the master's private quarters. He learned the particular sound of sandals on stone that meant he needed to arrange his expression before the door opened. He learned to read the quality of silence in a room, whether it was the silence of an empty house or the silence of someone waiting. These were not abstract fears. They were daily navigational requirements, as concrete and practical as knowing which streets in a Roman city were safe after dark and which were not. Survival in that house was not a matter of dramatic resistance. It was a matter of constant, exhausting, microscopic attention to mood, to timing, to the difference between a request and a command, even when both arrived in the same tone of voice. And the boy had no recourse. This is perhaps the detail that is hardest to hold clearly in the modern imagination because we live in a world, imperfect as it is, that at least nominally provides avenues of appeal, institutions of protection, a conceptual framework in which the violation of a person's body is recognized as a crime. That framework did not exist for him. There was no authority to appeal to. The Roman magistrate would not hear his case. The temple priest had no jurisdiction over a master's household. His own family, if any survived, if any were reachable, had no legal standing to intervene. In the city of Capernaum, on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, the Roman military presence took a particular form. A centurion was stationed there, a commander of approximately 80 soldiers, a man of real authority and, by the standards of his world, considerable wealth. The Gospel of Luke records that this centurion had a slave. The Greek word used is doulos, servant or slave, who was sick and near death, and whom the centurion valued highly. The word Luke uses to describe the centurion's regard for this slave is the Greek entomos, precious, highly valued. Matthew's account of the same story uses a different word for the slave, pais. In Greek, pais means both child and slave, and in certain first-century contexts, particularly in the literature surrounding Roman military culture, it carried a specific additional meaning that Matthew's audience would have understood, and that most modern readers pass over entirely. The Roman military had its own culture of enslaved attendants kept for the personal service of officers. The word pais, in that context, was a recognized designation. Jesus does not comment on this. He does not interrogate the centurion's household arrangements. He responds to the man's faith and heals the slave. But he is standing in Capernaum, in a region under Roman military occupation, and the people around him, the fishermen, the tax collectors, the women who have survived their own negotiations with the Roman world, know exactly what they are looking at when they look at a Roman centurion asking about his pais. Nothing in that world was invisible to the people living in it. The violence was everywhere. It simply had different names. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name in most languages. It is the loneliness of a person who is surrounded by people all day long and cannot speak truthfully to any of them. The young enslaved man in the Roman household knew this loneliness the way he knew the weight of the air in summer. Not as an idea, but as a physical condition, something he carried in his chest from the moment he opened his eyes in the morning to the moment he was permitted to close them at night. He was not isolated in the way a prisoner in a cell is isolated. He moved through rooms. He heard conversation. He was present at meals, at receptions, at the small domestic rituals that structured the life of a wealthy Roman household. But presence is not connection, and the particular nature of his position in that house created a social architecture around him that was nearly impossible to breach. The other enslaved workers in the household knew what he was. They knew because they had eyes, and because in a house where information was the only currency that passed between people without money, the precise configuration of the master's appetites was common knowledge within weeks of a new acquisition's arrival. But knowledge did not translate into solidarity, not reliably. In a household where enslaved people competed for the small advantages that made survival more bearable, a better sleeping position, a less exhausting assignment, the occasional extra portion of food, the boy kept for pleasure occupied a position that generated as much resentment as sympathy. He was not worked to physical exhaustion. He was not sent to the market in the rain. He ate better than the field slaves. And these facts were noted, calculated, and held against him by people who were themselves suffering and had nowhere else to direct the arithmetic of their grievance. This is one of the cruelties of a slave system that rarely appears in formal historical accounts. The way it systematically dismantled the possibility of solidarity among the enslaved by creating micro-hierarchies of suffering that set people against each other. The master did not need to design this intentionally. It emerged from the structure of scarcity itself. When dignity is distributed in small, insufficient quantities, people fight over the portions. The boy could not speak truthfully to his master. He could not speak freely to his fellow slaves. He could not reach his family. He could not pray at a temple in any way that acknowledged the reality of his life, because the gods of Rome had no category for his grievance. They were the gods of the Roman order, and the Roman order had decided that what happened to him was not a grievance, but a transaction. What he had, instead, was performance. An entire interior life translated, daily, into whatever expression the room required. Compliance worn as a face. This is not a metaphor. In Roman aesthetic culture, enslaved people kept for pleasure were sometimes trained explicitly in gesture, in posture, in the management of expression. They were taught to move in ways that pleased the eye. They were corrected when their affect failed to match the atmosphere the master wished to create. The performance was the job, and unlike a performer who leaves the stage, he could never leave. It is into this precise world, this world of performed compliance and invisible suffering, and the total legal annihilation of personhood, that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth arrived like a stone dropped into still water. Jesus did not arrive with a political program for the abolition of slavery. To read his ministry through that lens is to misread both the man and his moment. What he arrived with was something that cut deeper than legislation, because legislation requires an apparatus of enforcement that the kingdom of God, as Jesus described it, did not depend upon. What Jesus arrived with was a way of seeing. In the 14th chapter of Luke, Jesus is at dinner in the house of a prominent Pharisee. The room is full of people carefully arranged by social rank, who sits where, who is seen by whom, who is acknowledged, and who is not. And Jesus tells a story about a man who prepares a great banquet and sends invitations to all the expected guests, the people whose presence would honor him and confirm his status. And one by one, the expected guests decline. They have land to inspect. They have oxen to evaluate. They have wives and domestic obligations, and so the man sends his servant out, into the streets, into the alleys, into the margins of the city and says, "Bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. Bring in the people who were not on the original list. Fill the table with the ones nobody invited." The people listening to this parable in the first century heard it differently than we do. They did not hear it as a general encouragement toward inclusivity. They heard it as a precise social map, because they lived on that map. They knew exactly which streets the servant was sent into. They knew exactly what kinds of people were found there. The people whose bodies were owned, whose labor was extracted, whose suffering was legally invisible. The parable was not an abstraction. It was a description of a geography they navigated every day. And Jesus was telling them, those are the people at the table in the kingdom I am describing. Not as an afterthought, not as a gesture of charity from the host's abundance, as the point, as the guests the feast was always intended for. Once the people who thought they deserved the invitation revealed that they did not, in fact, want to come. For the young man in the Roman household, if these words ever reached him, through a traveling merchant, through a Jewish slave in the same household who had heard the stories circulating from Galilee, through the particular way that subversive ideas move through the lowest levels of a society, precisely because the powerful do not bother to monitor the conversations of people they have decided do not matter. Those words would have landed not as theology, but as recognition. Someone saw the table differently. Someone described a world in which the arrangement of the room was not permanent. Someone said that the people who had been treated as things were, in a different accounting, the ones the feast was for. This is not comfort, in any soft sense. The boy was still in the house the next morning. The master's sandals still made the same sound on the stone corridor. The door still opened without warning, but recognition, the experience of being seen accurately by someone who has the authority to define what is real, is not nothing. In a world designed to make certain people invisible, being seen is an act of profound power. Jesus was not offering an escape from the Roman household. He was refusing to agree that the Roman household's assessment of who mattered was the final word, and that refusal, quiet and total, was its own kind of revolution. There is a moment in the Gospel of John that most readers pass through quickly, because it appears to be a transitional scene, a logistical detail between two more dramatic events. Jesus is traveling through Samaria. He is tired. His disciples have gone into the nearby town to buy food, and he sits down alone beside a well. It is the 6th hour, which in the Roman timekeeping system used throughout the Gospels means midday, the hour when the sun is directly overhead and the heat is at its most absolute, when the stone of the well's rim is almost too hot to touch, and the dust of the road hangs motionless in the air because there is no wind. A woman comes to draw water, alone, at noon. Every person in the first-century audience who heard this story understood immediately what that detail meant. Women in Judea and Samaria drew water in the morning, in groups, when the air was cool and the social life of the village organized itself around the well. A woman who came alone at midday was a woman who could not come at any other time. A woman who had been excluded from the morning gathering. A woman whose presence among other women had become, for reasons the community had adjudicated, and she had been forced to absorb, unwelcome. Jesus speaks to her. This is already, by the social logic of his world, a series of violations stacked upon each other. A Jewish man does not speak to a Samaritan. A rabbi does not initiate conversation with an unknown woman in a public space. A person of any social standing does not linger at a well at noon in the company of someone whose reputation has been publicly marked. Every rule of the ancient Mediterranean honor-shame system points in the same direction. Look away, keep moving, do not engage. Jesus asks her for water. He asks her, the person in this scene with the least social capital, the person whose presence at this hour is itself a declaration of her exclusion, for something. He positions himself as the one in need. He opens the conversation not with a pronouncement, but with a request. And in doing so, he performs, in a single gesture, the complete inversion of every social hierarchy that the world around him had spent centuries constructing. Hold that image for a moment, and then carry it back to the Roman household in the heart of the empire, where the young enslaved man wakes each morning into a world that has assigned him a value, a function, and a silence, and has never once asked him what he needs. The distance between Samaria and Rome is, in first-century terms, enormous. Weeks of travel by road and sea, multiple languages, entirely different administrative and cultural systems. And yet the logic that produced the woman at the well and the logic that produced the boy in the Roman household were branches of the same root. Both were people whose personhood had been legally, socially, and philosophically subordinated to the requirements of others. Both moved through a world in which their interiority, their fear, their grief, their desire for something different, was not considered relevant data by the systems that governed their lives. What Jesus did, consistently, and without apparent strategic calculation, was treat that interiority as the most relevant data of all. In the 5th chapter of Matthew, in the section of the Sermon on the Mount that theologians call the Beatitudes, Jesus delivers a series of statements that begin with the Greek word makarios, usually translated as blessed, though the word carries a weight that the English rendering softens considerably. Makarios in the ancient world described a state of deep well-being, the kind of flourishing that the philosophers associated with a life fully and properly lived. It was a word used for the gods. It was used for the wealthy, the honored, the socially established. It was not a word that anyone in the 1st century would have instinctively associated with the poor, the grieving, the meek, or the persecuted. And Jesus takes this word that his audience associated with power and abundance and divine favor, and attaches it, one after another, to every category of person that the Roman world had decided was its opposite. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are the persecuted. For a young man whose entire existence had been organized around the pleasure and comfort and social reputation of someone else, whose grief had no public expression, whose body had been classified as property, whose hunger, not for food but for dignity, for recognition, for the basic experience of being treated as a person whose inner life mattered, went unnamed in every legal and philosophical framework available to his world. These words were not a theological proposition to be debated. They were a description of him, not of his shame, of his blessedness. The Roman world had a very clear account of what his life meant. It meant nothing beyond its utility. His beauty was an asset to be depreciated. His youth was a resource to be extracted. When he aged past the point of being considered attractive by Roman aesthetic standards, and that threshold arrived for enslaved boys kept in this role, often before they reached their mid-20s, his value in this particular market collapsed. He might be reassigned to labor. He might be sold. He might be freed, which in the Roman world meant released into a freedom that came with no resources, no family network intact, no legal protections worth speaking of, and a social stigma that followed the formerly enslaved through every subsequent interaction with Roman civic life. Freedom, in that context, was not a resolution. It was a different kind of exposure. Jesus does not offer him a resolution either, in any political or material sense. The Roman household does not dissolve. The legal category of res does not change. The Master's sandals continue to make their sound on the corridor stone. But Jesus offers something that no Roman law, no philosophical school, no religious institution of the ancient Mediterranean world had offered him: a cosmology in which he was not a thing, a universe in which his suffering was seen, named, and held, not as evidence of his insignificance, but as the precise location where the kingdom of God was pressing closest to the surface of the world. The early Christian communities that spread through the Roman Empire in the decades following the crucifixion were disproportionately populated by enslaved people and freedmen and freedwomen. This is not a coincidence. It is not sentimentality. It is a historical pattern that makes complete sense once you understand what those communities were offering. Not an escape from the empire's violence, but a counter-account of reality so radical in its insistence on the full personhood of every human being that it constituted. In the words of the historian Kyle Harper, a genuine civilizational rupture. The boy in the Roman household, if he found his way into one of those communities, meeting in a private home, in a room not unlike the rooms he navigated every day, but organized around a completely different principle of who sat where, and who was seen, and who was permitted to speak, would have encountered something he had perhaps never encountered before. People who already knew his name, not his slave name, assigned at purchase. His name, the one that existed in the part of him that the Roman household had no access to, the part that the law's category of res could not reach, the part that remained through everything, stubbornly, quietly, irreducibly human. That is the world Jesus walked through. That is the world his words were made in. Not in the abstraction of theology, not in the comfort of a culture that had resolved its contradictions, but in the middle of an empire that ran on the consumption of human beings, and in direct, unambiguous, costly opposition to everything that empire said about who mattered and why. To read the Gospels without this context is to read them in a kind of comfortable blur. To read them with it is to feel the ground shift beneath every familiar sentence. The blessedness of the meek. The feast prepared for the uninvited. The rabbi who asked a woman at a well, the wrong woman, at the wrong hour, in the wrong place, to give him something to drink. He saw her. He saw all of them. And in a world that had built its entire civilization on the practice of not seeing, that was everything.